In today's episode of the podcast, I'm joined by William V. Taylor. Taylor is a veteran of the Vietnam War, where he was awarded 3 Purple Hearts and his battalion earned 2 Presidential Unit citations. His battalion participated in 25 combat operations, and his new memoir, On Full Automatic, talks about his experience of surviving 13 months in Vietnam. I really enjoyed having this conversation, and in it we talk about why he decided to write his story and tell the history from his perspective of the Vietnam War almost 50 years later. We talk about his enlistment and his training and some of the feelings and emotions that went into that before he saw combat. We talk about the nature of combat for his battalion over the course of his 13 months in Vietnam, how that changed over time or didn't change over time. We talk about the overall military strategy of the United States and how that at times seemed to clash with the reality of the situation on the ground for soldiers like Taylor. We talked about the role of the environment, the heat, the terrain, the animals, the insects, nighttime versus daytime operations, and how all of that stuff impacted him. We talked about his perspective of the nature of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, his relationship to civilians in Vietnam, and the murky nature and moral quandaries that were all too prevalent in the Vietnam War and wars like it. We talked about the role of communication between the soldier and civilians back home, how letter writing and other forms of communication played a role for him during the war. We talked about the role of the Vietnam War on soldiers and on veterans as they came back home. And we also discussed other topics related to the Vietnam War. I really enjoyed this one, and I hope that you do as well. All right, so I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was, here we are 50 years later after your time in Vietnam, and what was it that made you want to tell this story? Why did you kind of want to tell it, and why now as opposed to any other time?
That's a really a good question. So I always wanted to tell the story. Actually, when I first came home, I had nightmares. It was really bad. You wake up in the middle of the night and you're screaming and yelling, and you're right back into the battles that you were in. And that went on for quite a while. And finally it subsided. And, we didn't want anything to do with the military, the government, or anything else, even the people, because when we came home, there wasn't anything. As a matter of fact, you were ridiculed, you were called names in the airports, so you didn't even want to wear your uniform anymore. And so when all that passed, and I remember my dad, when I used to ask him about World War II, he was fighting with Patton. And I thought that would have been really interesting to hear what my dad did and how he went through Belgium. And he was actually in the Battle of the Bulge. I heard all the stories from the family members that he was there, but he would never tell me any stories. He'd just say, you don't want to know anything about that. Somewhat similar to what the guys today in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, something like that. They just don't want to talk about it. And I was pretty much one of those guys. And I realized that, history has to be told. And nothing was being said about the Vietnam War for a long time. The real story of what the ground troops were going through, I hadn't really read a lot of stories that were actually depicted the actual events that happened. And when my kids started asking me about, what I did in the war, I didn't want to do what my dad did. I wanted to actually open up and start talking to him. And that actually was the beginning of me thinking about writing the book. As I was telling the stories, they, to me, in my mind, you don't think those stories when you first are coming home. You don't think those stories. Everybody went through that. Everybody. So you think it's nothing. And then as time goes on, and you start telling the stories about the different battles you were in, and I started realizing this is really a great story to tell people to what really happened. And so I do know in the Civil War that the only way that people really knew what happened are by the letters that the troops wrote home, about the different battles. And uh, I said, history has to know what's going on in this Vietnam War. So I started taking notes about 10 years ago and writing them down and putting in an envelope. And I would save them and save them and save them. And I would tell people, I'm going to be writing this book. And they would start asking, so have you started your book yet? It was one of these procrastination type things that I was doing, and I didn't realize it. And then someone came up and said something that really, aren't so you've been like saying you're going to write a book, but you never aren't you going to write it? And I go, you know what? That's it. I'm going to start writing the book. And then I started writing and telling stories. And that's how it started out, just telling a random story here and there and here and there. And then all of a sudden, it started to take place in my mind that this is actually, I really need to put it in the 13 months that I spent over there. I need to spread that out and let people know what happened. And as a matter of fact, maybe I'll make it the 13 months, 13 chapters. I mean, my mind was going in this direction. And so when I actually started sitting down and writing the stories, I mean, when I was through with the story, I had to put the pen down. I had to just go like wrap up in the bed and just cry my eyes out, because it became so emotional of the stories of the men that lost their lives. So, I just kept working on it. And 3 years later, it finally came to fruition that, now I could actually, and I really had to do a lot of research. I'm a high school graduate. I wasn't a good high school graduate as it was. I wasn't very good in English. So I had to research and find out how to actually write a book. And that's part of it, was learning the craft of writing a book. And so when I thought it was done, I went and I had like people read it, beta readers for me, you might say. And people would say, well, you got this and that and this and that. And I would change everything. And then it just went, edit, edit, edit. And then I thought I finally had it. And someone read it I had 40 beta readers. 40 people read my manuscript and actually critiqued it for me. And each one of them was saying, I can't find a lot wrong, but I'll tell you what, this is going to be a great book, make a great movie. And I thought, wow, I'm glad to hear these people say this. And I'm trying to get them to be very critical, because that's what you need, is someone critical. And so someone said, if I were you, I would get a good editor. So I found two good editors, one for structure, one for the actual, make sure all the spelling was correct and everything. And all the, periods were in there, commas, or make sure it was all structured right. And after I did that, I mean, it just like it was a flower. You're trying to get it to blossom, and then finally with the editors, it just opened up, and that's pretty much what happened.
Yeah, so I can definitely attest, it had an impact on me going through the book, and I know there's a lot of other people out there who it's had an impact on, and I think some of the stories in there are really unbelievable. And maybe we could kind of start at the beginning, and maybe you could talk about why you decided to enlist. I think this was before the draft, when you were over there. So what types of feelings and emotions and, sort of logic went into that decision to enlist?
It's a funny story. So I graduated from high school in 1966, and all my friends were going to college, and my grades were not that good. My childhood wasn't that structured. It wasn't that good. And I didn't realize I had a problem with my eyes. I would read, and then all of a sudden I'd start seeing double, and then I would get, I'd struggle to try to read, and then I'd just set it down, and I never finished the reading. I didn't realize I had a problem with vision. And so that was part of the reason why I was having a problem. So anyway, I said I have to do something with my life, and I just couldn't imagine what it was. And I was hearing that they were starting to draft into the Army. And I went to all my friends and I asked them, what was the best service to go in? And everyone said, the best is the Marines. So I went and saw a Marine recruiter, and I told him, I said, I'd like to have aviation. And he said, well, we can do that if you want to join. If we could put you into the aviation sector. And I said, great. I could see myself fixing helicopters at maybe O'Hare or Midway airports. You know what I mean? Just after I got out, I'd have a craft and actually have something I could do. Might even be able to enjoy it. So that's exactly what happened. Was I decided to join the Marines, and I said I'm going to spend the whole summer. I had an agreement that I had aviation, and so I went to boot camp in September and came out of boot camp somewhere around December. And I looked, everybody was gathering around the board where they used to post things. And I went and I'm working my way through, and I'm looking to see what my new MOS is. And, that's your military occupational specialty. So I look, and I'm getting up for it, and then I'm going down and I'm looking at the names, and all of a sudden I come to Taylor, and it said 0311, Basic Infantryman, Westpac Ground Forces. I go, this is not what I joined for. I wanted aviation. As a matter of fact, on the papers that I had, there was an arrow and it said aviation right towards my name. I said, this is something. So I went to the CO, the commanding officer, and I asked him, I said, I was guaranteed that I was going to get aviation. And so he said, where are your papers? I said, well, when I got on those little yellow footprints, you took me into a building and made me strip down, and we had to throw everything, up on the counter, and everything was put into a box and sent home. And he says, well, just show me the papers. That's all. Just show me the papers. I was so excited, So I called my aunt where I had sent the box to. She looked in the box and she said, there's no papers in there. There's no papers whatsoever. So apparently with when you're taking off your clothes and you're all like terrified, and you don't know where you're at, everything is so terrifying and so different. And so you take your clothes and they're putting them and you're putting them in the bag, but they didn't put they didn't put any of the orders in there because I guess the government's paying for the postage. And so therefore, that's how I ended up over in Vietnam. And that's how I ended up joining.
Based on the book, you get over there and you do about a month of sort of training, different situations and trying to get ready for what you were going to be doing on your missions and operations. And I wanted to talk about like one of the big things that gets taught about the Vietnam War is sort of the role of the environment. So there's obviously heat and jungle, and you're walking around with these huge equipment packs, and there's nighttime operations, and there's insects and bugs and booby traps. So I wanted to ask you, what was the role of the environment, and all of that is not even including the fact that there's people shooting at you. What do you think was the role of the environment for you? How did you experience it? And do you think it's sort of accurately depicted nowadays in the way the war gets talked about?
Well, I can tell you my unit was unique. If you have a battalion of Marines and they're based in a certain area like Da Nang or one of the bases that are going up towards the DMZ, they're sweeping that area. So they get used to the area. And they know where the mortars are usually set to come in and try to, and they know where the snipers can come in. With us being Special Landing Force Alpha, we would take off on the USS Okinawa helicopter ship, and then we'd have an assault. So we were the newest weapon to defeat the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. We were that new weapon that these battalions that were going out there, they would sweep. And of course, as they sweep, the enemy would just leave. Well, we came in and blocked their retreat. So, we were the unexpected. We were the trump card to say. We would come in and then we would land and then we would get in position. We'd either be a blocking force or attacking force. So when you ask the question, what was the terrain like? The terrain that we were in varied all the time, dependent on if we were in the Quezon Valley, we had to deal with the mountains, the surrounding hills around us. We had to deal with the farmers in the valley that were with the rice fields. And then as we got close to the mountains, now we're getting into the jungles. And then we'd go into the DMZ. We'd fly into the DMZ. You'd have a battalion of 1,300 Marines coming in, just on helicopters, wave after wave. And so you were an individual walking into, you never knew what you were going to walk into. I mean, explosion over here to the right, someone, sniper shooting at you from the left. And you'd walk and you go a day or two or three and nothing would happen. And someone stepped on a punji pit. Then all of a sudden, the snake comes right at you and you just like freak out. You see bombs laying around and you have to call engineers and blow the bombs up. So you had so many the tunnels. I mean, that was another thing. The tunnels, they had this incredible tunnel system that you'd run across an area and it was just like everywhere you looked, there was holes going into the mountains and the hills. And, we had tunnel rats and stuff like that, but we didn't. Basically, what we had to advance. We had to keep moving on, and that's what we did. There was haystacks all over, and if someone's shooting at you from a haystack, that's coming from that direction. There's a haystack. There's trees. There's weeds. You don't know what's going on, so you just try to, you try to maybe circle around if you have time, or try not to get hit. And of course, helicopters were our main support. So, if we needed evacuation, they'd send in a helicopter. Every 3 days we had food. We never had a hot meal in the field the whole 13 months. And when we'd leave the ship, we'd be off the ship for at least 45 days, sweeping from operation to another operation. They would pick us up and move us into another area. So we were always on the attack. And so we were always in the different, in the elephant grass and leeches and bears and tigers. And people don't even realize the different animals that we run across, the centipedes. And, it's all the way that you perceive things. I mean, if you look at the whole thing as a nightmare, you're going to be a nervous wreck the whole time you're there. But if you just kind of get used to the environment and whatever you're dealing with at the time, and believe me, the mud and the rice paddies, you had to walk. If you were in it got so after a while. When we first got there, we were so young and naive. The guys that had joined the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, Charlie Company, the different companies. So when you first got there, you're so naive, but as you start going through the operations, you get smarter and smarter and understand more. And the crazy thing was, as soon as you got to know exactly what you're doing and how to stay alive, it's your rotation time. You go home and a brand new guy has to come and learn those lessons all over again. And the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese and South, they didn't have that. They just kept on fighting and fighting, and they got more experience than us. And they were fast. They didn't have the big gear. They lived off the food of the area, and it became very difficult. The one thing we had over them was the superiority of air support and artillery. That really helped us out a lot.
Yeah, so you talked about learning those lessons in the field and just sort of in the heat of the moment and trying to survive. One of the things I thought was really interesting in your book was how you talked about how the environment and the terrain kind of works for both sides. So what might be a piece of cover or some area to hide for you in one moment could easily turn into a place where the enemy could set up an ambush, or what might be the moon not coming out that night and being total darkness might be, helpful for you if you're doing a nighttime operation, but might also be good for the enemy to planting an ambush. So I was wondering if you could talk about that sort of seesaw where you were kind of constantly having to factor in how does this help us, but how does it also help, the other side.
For the longest time, we didn't even see them. We didn't see the enemy. They were stealthy. They were they were great at camouflage. Um, they had they had the punji pits, which were totally hidden. Uh, we might get hit pretty hard. Guys were getting wounded and stuff like that. But once we maneuvered into a situation, that's when we knew where they were, and that's when you call in the jets. So we were able to. I think the big key for us was that heavy artillery and the jets. I talk about Puff. We call it Spooky. Another one. It's a plane that flies overhead with miniguns, and when it fires its guns, it could cover every square inch of a football field in a minute. I mean, the bullets coming down from that plane, if they know where they're at, and they've got, they did have some, heat seeking. They could tell where the enemy was running and stuff. And so I think the stealthiness, when you, it, we were always behind the eight ball because we were always moving, looking for them. And one thing about this was the height of the Vietnam War. We could wipe out 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and they would just keep sending more and more troops because the more that we had, the more they kept on sending down. And they were willing to sacrifice those guys, especially the North Vietnamese was willing to sacrifice the Viet Cong because they have this, the North and South have a little bit of a, animosity towards each other, almost like the United States North and South back in the Civil War. They had the same type of thing. All the food and everything was grown in the South, and the industrial was in the North and the Hanoi. But they needed the food. The rice bowl of the world was right there in Vietnam. So it became really difficult to go into the different areas and have to. You had to constantly adjust your thinking and where you're at and what you're doing. They were very stealthy. Towards the end of my tour, that's when we really started. I mean, we were, you could say some of us were hand to hand. Some of us, we were so close as you could touch somebody and you're killing them. And you're just trying to save your own life. I mean, you don't even think about there's a human being there. What you think is he's got a gun and he's going to kill me. And it's more of a just trying to stay alive. So there was a shift. When we first got there, it was more, they were hidden more. But as we were working in the DMZ, they came out and they still had their tunnels. They still had all that stuff. But they were willing to come out and fight us. And, we had a lot of technology that really helped us. Towards the end of my tour, we even had motion detectors, way out there so you could detect sounds and stuff right from. So if you're in a base, you had this ability, night scopes at the end of my tour that they came out, and so you could actually, we got into a lot of conflicts with them, definitely. But the difference was they were stealthy and we had to carry these huge packs.
So you talk about a lot of the sort of missions and operations that you went on, and it seems like, and I'd obviously love to get your opinion on this, but it seems like in the book you're sort of implying from a big picture military strategy standpoint, it felt like at times you sort of felt like it was a little bit murky and sort of just unclear what sort of the big picture strategy was. So it kind of seems
Sure.
like on a lot of these missions, sort of the objective is just to locate, VC or North Vietnamese and clear them out, or and it was kind of like a numbers game that your superiors kept asking you, how many KIA, how many did you get, type of thing. And you, over the course of the book, it seems like you're becoming more and more skeptical of this sort of overall strategy as your time there is going on. So, do you think that's something that's accurate there, or how would you view that?
Well, when you first get there, I even posed the question in the book. One of the old salts asked me, "What are we doing here in Vietnam?" And my reply was, "Well, we're stopping communism dead in its tracks. We're going to stop them so they don't take over the world." And he said, "So that's what they told you, but what do you think?" And I was just kind of wondering what he was thinking about. And then as time went on, that question, resonated inside of me, especially when I came up with the conclusion of, who are we actually fighting? Well, we were fighting the North Vietnamese, and they were coming through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, coming down to the DMZ and going south. But we were also fighting the Viet Cong. And who were the Viet Cong? The Viet Cong were the South Vietnamese. Well, I thought I was here helping the South Vietnamese. There's something wrong here. Why are all these people mad at us for trying to help them? And what I realized is, we're talking about people from the Stone Age. They lived in huts with bamboo made rugs on the floor and crude pots, and eating over fires and trudging in a field all day long. And they just seemed like they were ancient, and they didn't want us there. You could see they would look us in the eyes. They wanted nothing to do with us. Their heads were always low. There was no young women anywhere to be found. No young men. All the men and all the women that were of fighting age were gone. And so, you wonder what's going on here. And it seemed like the more north you went, the more Viet Cong villages were that we had to fight in, and the people were against us. And I think some of the people, they just wanted to be left alone and just let me farm, just get out of here, let me live my life. But that's not what happened. And then obviously, as you start talking about the war, and you find out about the French and Dien Bien Phu, and you start thinking, well, the French tried to take this place over, and the Chinese and the Japanese, and the French did take it over, and they kicked them out. And it's like, what's going on here? This is crazy. By the end of the tour, I just wanted to go home. I knew I could depend on the people that I was fighting with. I just wanted to go home. And so, yeah, that's pretty much, my thoughts had changed. And also, the way the war was going was pretty critical. So we had Operation Beaver Cage, where we got our first casualties. That was our first operation. But then we came to this one operation in July, and our platoon sergeant was the greatest platoon sergeant ever. He was on his second tour already, and he knew what the heck he was doing. And him and one of the squad leaders, they were leading a charge into this in the DMZ, where he had to take over this tree line, and it had been bombed. Like, you can't even believe how it was bombed and bombed and bombed. And now we're going to assault it. And as soon as we assaulted it, the platoon commander was shot along with a 50 caliber. We're talking, they had big holes in them. And when you see your leadership, who you really look to, and see them die, that kind of puts a void of, like, who's going to come next. So then we go into Operation Cochise, which is another one where, we're assaulting a tree line, and all of a sudden it opens up on us, and immediately my new platoon sergeant, he's now killed. Everybody in my platoon is wiped out, except there was only 7 of us out of 50 left. And it's just like, now who are they going to put in charge? And then they put some goofy guys in charge, guys who didn't know what they were doing. So it's like if you saw the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson. You know, can you imagine in the beginning of that battle if he was killed? If Mel Gibson, I mean, he had something shot off his shoulder and all this other stuff, but if he had been killed, if that bullet had been here instead of here, and he actually got hit and died, he was the leader. And when you lose a leader, you got to put someone else in charge. And then what happens is when they die or if they're promoted or whatever happens, now you got people who are coming in and they don't know what they're doing and they're telling you what to do. And they're telling you things that you know you're going to die. So how can you fight a battle when all these great leaders are all dead and they're putting idiots in charge of you? I'm not going to say idiots. They're just less experienced people. I mean, you're not going to fight a war to be an idiot. You're going to serve your country and thinking you're doing right. And that's what we did back in those days. We always had that John Wayne theory. We were the good guys. We're always doing right. And that's when the big ta-da hit me over in Vietnam was, what are we doing here? What is this? Why are all these people dying? And what are we here for? I mean, it didn't seem like we were here for the reasons that we were told. And that was very disappointing to me. And I just wanted to get out at the end. And but then I had to go through a few other battles, getting overrun and getting trapped with my M16 not being functional. It kept on jamming on me all the time. So that's one of the hardest things. If you're in battle and your weapon stops, you're screwed. I mean, you're literally, I mean, you have nothing else. You got your grenades, you got your bayonet that you put on the end of your M16, but pretty much that's it. And when you're surrounded, believe me, it's scary. So yeah, it's pretty, but it's also, I also bring out the day-to-day things that we they're not boring. None of the things I talk about are boring. They're the excitement things in my brain that says, oh, you got to tell this story. This is interesting. People will like to hear this story. So the whole book is just a series of true stories of especially the story about the baby. That's such a touching, it brings tears to my eyes even to this day. When you get heartfelt about people and things, and then your heart's ripped out, and you're nowhere. And your girlfriend, she's either dear Johns you or just never writes again. You're fighting for your life, and your high school sweetheart is no longer writing you. It's such a devastating feeling. It's like, what's going on? Is she dead? Is she? So all of these feelings come out in the book. And I think I cover a lot of the feelings what a lot of us were going through at the time. There was a lot of people going through the same thing. So my book brings out what everybody did, that we were fighting in the DMZ, we were fighting in the trenches, we were just trying to save our lives. And some guys did some unbelievably brave things. And it's, you just have to acknowledge the people that, some panicked, some couldn't handle it. Some people just couldn't take the war. They just had to get out. And then there was that mean sergeant. The guy was so mean. I swear, Vietnam was hell, but now this guy, add him into the mix. And so it gives you. One thing I want people to feel with that book was to be there, to actually get a sense of what it was like to be there, as opposed to just reading a book and saying I was there. To actually make people feel the feelings and the emotions that's going on.
Yeah, so I think your book definitely achieves that. And as you're saying there, you're kind of taking this perspective that's from you, and you're going through your day to day, and you're giving, just kind of the basic details of what it was like. But when you put all that together, and given your experiences and the overall situation, it really is, an exciting, incredible story. I did want to ask you, you brought up the Dear John stuff. I wanted to ask you in general, It sounds like you wrote a lot of letters home, and you mentioned you did get Dear John there. Like, what was the role of letter writing for you? So it seems like for you, you kind of did it more than other guys, maybe. So was there something about it that kind of helped you out, or just made you feel a certain way, or how did you feel about that?
Well, I didn't want to lose contact with the people home. So I had about 13 to 15 people that I would write, and they always wrote me back. And as long as I kept writing them, they would write me. But if I stopped writing them, then they would stop writing me. It was almost like, well, I have to get a letter from you. Well, I'm out in the field for 30, 45 days at a time. And we had to carry our letter writing gear in a pack. And of course, he had it in some kind of plastic so it would get wet. And so you just write, you'd write that quick letter. Sometimes I had to write it on toilet paper. Sometimes I had to write it on a box and send it home because, there's no more paper to write, and or something got destroyed or ruined. And so it all we had to do was write on the envelope free in the top right hand corner. And then when the helicopters would come in for resupply, you'd give them the letter, and they would take them and give them to the ship. And then the ship would send them home. So it's not like today when today you see movies and depicting a guy in Iraq and he's calling home and talking to his wife and they're seeing each other. In Vietnam, he wrote a letter, and it took a good 2 weeks to get that letter to its location. And then when they sent you you'd ask for packages or, geez, I could use some, this, I could really use some things that would really help me here. And my dad and my sister were, my aunt would send me a box every once in a while. And it took so long. It took so long. I mean, any kind of like a sausage that wasn't really packed well, or something that could easily, degrade, uh, it would happen for sure. And so some of your packages would come, and you'd look at it and go, "Oh boy, this thing is," it was really funny. My sister, she had someone had told her to wrap the whole thing in popcorn, and she thought it was regular popcorn. And it was the little styrofoam things. So my sister had put popcorn and they had packed it, and when I had I opened it up, and it was the blackest, gnarliest package I ever received in my life. I couldn't figure it out, and then I was talking to one of the guys. I said, "Why would she do that?" And he goes, "Oh gosh, they must have told her to put it in popcorn. They meant the styrofoam because we'd have styrofoam also in there, and she put popcorn in, and that's what they called it back then, was popcorn, not peanuts or whatever."
I guess it's the thought that counts.
Yeah, it's the thought that counts.
Yeah. Um, I did want to ask you, I don't think I saw any of this in the book, but did you have any encounters while you're over there with the media or war correspondents or like journalists or anyone like that? I know earlier in our conversation here, you kind of talked about how you're over there for 13 months, and it's not like today. You're not, there's no internet, there's no instant communication. So when you came back, it was just a different world. And I was just wondering if you had any of those sort of interactions with any media types of people while you were over there.
I, I was front lines, so I didn't see a single one myself. I didn't, but I heard that there was somebody with us once, and they were walking with battalion. In other words, the center where everybody is protected. And I just heard once, and that was at Operation Buffalo, and they actually had pictures of that operation uh, in the newspapers. And I was surprised. My dad sent me newspapers every once in a while. And here's the battle I was in. It was Bravo Company 19. We called them the Walking Dead. And they had got into a horrible ambush. 250 men would be a company of men. And they walked into an ambush, and 200 of them were either killed or wounded. Most of them were killed. And so when you have that many men, of course, you don't hear about it at home, how many men are actually dying. You don't hear that number. But they flew us in. They brought us to the ship and then took us right back out because they steamed towards the DMZ, and then we had to go in and we had to help recover the bodies. But the North Vietnamese were still there. They were there in force, and they were setting up traps for us everywhere. So we had battalions coming in from all different directions, and eventually they got overwhelmed, and they killed a lot of Marines on that operation. So the fact that when you have that much action, these guys aren't going to want to stay around. A whole company of Marines, that means the reporters would have been killed too. So we didn't see a lot of reporters. And we did have our own, a guy who took pictures, but he wasn't in the fighting either. Nobody was in the fighting but the forward guys. Now, I heard that there were instances where there were some reporters that maybe with an Army unit or with somebody else. But and another thing I want to bring up is the fact that the Marines back in 1967 and 1968, we didn't have the funding. We ate Korean War chow. They didn't give us the newest chow. Marines wanted to use what they had in storage and wanted to get it out. And so they went through all that. They probably stored the new stuff, which strategically is a good idea. But when you're a combat troop and you're getting stuff from the Korean War, you're going, what the heck's going on here? We had the old helicopters. We had the old CH-34s, which is the big bubble nose on them. And those were slower. And we should have had Hueys. When the 101st Airborne came up in 1968, there are more helicopters in that one Army unit than the entire Marine Corps. So we never got the funding. The packs we used were so terrible. It's almost a shame that we had to fight the way we fought. Army units had hot meals sent to them in the field because they had the helicopters. We didn't have hot meals. Never had a hot meal sent to us in the field. So, when you're the whole I Corps areas where most of the deaths occurred of Marines and Army guys that came up north to try to help us. And I see why the Army came up, because they couldn't replace the Marines that were getting wiped out. They just couldn't replace the number of Marines that were getting wiped out. So they had to bring in another Army unit. And I think it was the 101st Airborne.
I think that story and a lot of stories like it, you're highlighting, just some of the struggles as far as, some insight into the leadership and the administrative structure and sort of the differences between what you're being told and what the facts are happening on the ground. And of course, how all that plays out. And you have to factor in, the role of the environment and kind of what you talked about earlier with civilians and just kind of the changing nature, the murky nature of the enemy. So one of the big themes of your book, I think, that you ask a lot is sort of, was it worth it, your time over there? And I don't know if the answer to that is something you want to talk about, but I was hoping maybe you could talk about some of the, what made you decide like that was the question that you wanted to be asking in the book, and what sort of led you to be asking that question?
Well, I've read books about the Vietnamese people. I've read their struggle to get out and to come to freedom. Some of them were boat people. They're writing books now about what their struggles were. There was about a Viet Cong who didn't realize what the war was about, what the Americans were thinking, and he was just angered at the way that the Americans and the structure of the government was. They just didn't like what was happening, and so when you read all these books, and was it worth it? Well, in some cases, when I read some of the books, you have to say, well, to these people, it was worth it. To these different people that found freedom. For the soldiers, was it worth it to come home and to live a life of PTSD, Agent Orange? I think some of those guys, and they're very proud of their service for serving their country. But was it worth it? I leave that to the reader, especially with the way I structured the book. I have that question out there to let the reader come up with that answer, because there's a lot of pros to what we were doing and there's a lot of cons to what we were doing. But when you look at and reading my book and see what it was like firsthand on the ground, most of the soldiers might say it wasn't worth it. The one American life. These people, you get to know these people in my book that die. You get to feel who they are and understand, and they become individuals. And so when something happens to them, you don't know which person it's going to happen to, but it happens a lot. And so was it worth it? I leave that up to the reader. My own personal feeling, I think it was started on a lie. The war was started in the Tonkin Gulf resolution, which destroyers said they were being fired on, and they actually weren't. And then we declared war over a lie. That's not good. That's not good to start a war over a lie. Any reason you want to use, you could find a reason, I imagine. But starting a war on a lie is not a good idea. And was there weapons of mass destruction? Was that another lie? I don't know. But, was it worth it? Look at the way we pulled out of there. If you look at what happened in Vietnam, I'm sitting at home. I've fought for my country. All these guys died. I've got all these emotions running inside me about the war. And I'm watching the TV and I'm watching the tanks take over Saigon and the helicopters flying off the tall building. Now we're supposed to learn from our lessons. But here we go. We end up in Afghanistan, and pretty much, we fought to get rid of the Taliban, and all we did was make them stronger by leaving all of the weapons there. And it's like, here we go again. It's another. Is it worth it? Was it? You asked the soldiers of Iraq and Afghanistan if it was worth it. They came home. Their wives sometimes, left them, and that throws. When you have stress like PTSD, and then all of a sudden some major event happens, you just blow your brains out. You just can't. You say, I'm ending it. And that's what you see in the Vietnam War veterans, and now you're seeing it in the Iraq and Afghan veterans that fought for the country, and they come back and their lives are destroyed. And what was it worth it for them? They blow their brains out. I guess there's like 10 veterans a day, ending their life with a bullet. So, it's a good question, isn't it? Was it worth it?
An important question. And I think that a lot of times sort of the human element of the impact of war and the way it's devastating to really everybody involved, amazingly kind of goes under the radar, and a lot of people focus on the big picture political stuff going on, and that's why I think your book was so interesting, is that it kind of just gives your experience and then the human element and the cost of what everything was to you and the people around you, and I would hope that people learn from that lesson and consider that as, as people make decisions going forward. I'm mindful of your time here. We're getting close to an hour. Is there anything you wanted to bring up or talk about, or?
So the book is resonating with a lot of people. I check my Amazon, uh, sometimes up to 30, 35 books a day go out. It shocks me that there's so many people reading the book. It's all becoming a word of mouth. Every once in a while, I go on a podcast like this, and people are interested to find out. And when they find out and they read it, they have a tendency to pass it on. And I get a lot of letters from people, and it's healing a lot of the Vietnam vets. It's healing some of the families. I even got a letter, an email from a protester, a person who protested the war back in 1967. And she asked for forgiveness. She said, I didn't know. She read the book. She said, I didn't know what you guys went through. And I feel so bad. She said, I was just following the crowd and I thought I was doing right. And I just feel so bad now that I hope you would forgive me. And of course, I wrote her back and said, we're all victims of that war. And, I told her that, it's all in the past and doesn't mean anything anymore. But yes, of course, I forgive you. And I totally understand what you were doing at the time. I'm sure you thought you were doing right. So, but I'm getting. There was one lady. She also said to me, "I want to thank you for writing the book." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, my dad read the book, and I've been trying to have a relationship with him for 50 years. He came home from Vietnam. He became an alcoholic, and my mom divorced him. He moved off the hills of Alabama. And I've been contacting him and asking him stories. And he read your book. And when he read your book, he called me and he started talking about the war and he started talking about getting together. And she said, I now have this relationship I never had before. So the book is healing people. It's some of the vets are saying, thank you for telling my story, because it's not only my story, it's everybody's story. And so as long as I get that healing and get all of it, right now there's 1,408 uh, ratings on Amazon, and the book has only been out a short time. It's only been out since like August is when it really came out. So and the reviews are through the roof. If anybody read the Amazon reviews, they're just right through the roof. It's touching a lot of people's hearts. And a lot of the servicemen are saying this guy is right on, exactly accurate of our service in Vietnam. So I guess that would be the only thing. Uh, we got to give a lot of kudos to the guys that fight for this country, and and I'm very proud to have written this book, and it's touching so many people's hearts. I mean, that's the key. That's why I spent so much time, just so that people would understand, and history would now tell the story. This is what happened. And anybody who wants to know what happened in Vietnam, it's a really, you want to know what a combat, your uncle, your father, anybody who died in Vietnam, this is a good way to find that individual person. So to see what they went through.
Absolutely. So important to tell those stories, and I'm glad that it's resonating with people. And I can definitely see why after reading the book. So again, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time, and I hope some of the listeners of the podcast get something out of the conversation.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time too.
All right, take care. Have a great day.
You too.